Golden leaves swirled on the stone path as Ellen Rowe opened an envelope that hadn't come from a bill collector or charity in years. It came from her family. She stared at the script, blue ink, a soft slant, deliberate like someone who practiced cursive on thank you cards. There was no return address, but she didn't need one. Her fingers paused just above the flap. Maple Hollow's wind tugged at her cardigan, and the brass mailbox creaked closed behind her as if urging her back indoors. She opened it anyway. Inside, an invitation printed on thick, textured cardstock, the kind reserved for weddings and donor dinners. Rowe Family Thanksgiving, November 24th, 3 p.m., hosted by Nate and Lydia Rowe. Then, scribbled in a different hand beneath the RSVP line, we'd love your thoughts on a new project. She stood there for a while, envelope in one hand, the chill creeping into her sleeves. Birds flitted from one bare branch to another across the road. A car rolled slowly past the house, tires crunching on early frost. Ellen turned toward the porch, boots tapping rhythmically on the steps. The letter felt heavier than it should have. She set it gently on the pine table by the front window. Her thumb brushed across a ring on the tabletop. Her grandfather's mug used to sit there, always too close to the edge. Light poured through the old glass panes, illuminating the faint scratches on the wood like veins beneath skin. The scent of percolating coffee filled the space, steady and grounding. Ellen slipped on her gloves and stepped back outside. The day was crisp, the kind of November morning that hinted at snow without promising it. She walked toward Main Street, the sidewalks strewn with leaves and the occasional flyer for fall festivals that had already passed. She nodded at a man on a ladder hanging pine garland above the hardware store, and he nodded back, wordless but familiar. Past the faded mural of Maple Hollow's founding and the red brick library with its always closed side door, she slowed near the old paper mill, now the weekend farmer's market. It had been her first donation under a quiet LLC name, just enough to fund the repaving and a few community stalls. She never told anyone. She didn't need her name on a plaque. The Bean and Hollow Diner sat at the corner, with its crooked sign and window boxes that somehow still held mums in bloom. She pushed open the door, and the bell overhead gave its usual wheeze. Warmth, butter, and brewed coffee greeted her like old friends. "Well, look what the wind dragged in," Loretta called from behind the counter, silver hair piled high like meringue. "Thanksgiving already, huh? Still not talking to your folks?" Ellen smiled without answering, choosing her usual corner booth. She always sat facing the window. Loretta brought over coffee without asking and set down a slice of pecan pie, slightly warmed, just how Ellen liked it. "They'll be putting up that ugly blow-up turkey on City Hall by Thursday," Loretta said, topping off the cup. "Can't say I'll miss it when the snow finally flattens the poor thing." Ellen chuckled softly, stirring cream into her coffee, watching the milk cloud spiral before settling. Her eyes followed the street outside, where familiar buildings lined up like old friends too polite to comment on how long it had been. Back home, she toed off her boots and padded across the creaking floorboards. Her laptop sat on the old secretary desk in the corner, flanked by neat stacks of notebooks and an empty clay vase. She logged in. The dashboard loaded slowly, as if deciding whether to trust her. Then, there it was, $97,302,185. Her company, originally coded from her attic, had been quietly expanding, a circular economy platform for small-town makers. She glanced at the calendar pinned above. Forbes feature goes live, November 21st. 3 days. She leaned back in the chair, staring at the blinking cursor. They'd all know soon. Not just Maple Hollow. Not just Nate and Lydia. Everyone. The envelope still sat on the pine table. She picked it up again and walked into the kitchen, steam rising from the stovetop where a kettle threatened to whistle. She didn't bother. She stood by the window, same as she had as a child watching snow roll in, hands tucked beneath her elbows. Her lips moved, barely above a whisper. "Maybe it's time we made things right." She folds the letter slowly, sets it on the old pine table, and murmurs, "Now they want my input?" Ellen Rowe had mastered the art of silence, so much so, it was now a comfort. But the past had its own voice, and tonight, it whispered loudly. She sat cross-legged on the rug in front of the fireplace, a mug of chamomile cooling nearby, untouched. The crackle of oak logs echoed in the room, a slow rhythm that matched the sound of rain tapping gently on the window panes. Her notebook rested open on her lap, pages yellowed, spirals slightly bent. It smelled faintly of cinnamon oil, an old trick she used to use when packing holiday orders to make them feel more like gifts than goods. She traced a sentence on the page with her finger. It was written in her own handwriting from years ago, back when she believed the world just needed more beautiful, useful things made with care. What if waste is just potential waiting for the right eyes? That had once made her smile. She hadn't thought of it in years. On the next page was a sketch, an early design of a lamp made from reclaimed chicken wire and sea glass. Next to it, a note in pencil: "Lydia says Nate thinks it's too crafty, not sellable." Ellen shut the notebook gently, not wanting the memory to spill any further. But it came anyway. The Rowe family dining room had always smelled of polish and roast meat, with too many chairs squeezed around a table meant for fewer people. Thanksgiving 2007 had been no different. Ellen had arrived from her tiny apartment in Pittsburgh with a tote full of handmade gifts, ornaments she created from soda tabs and vintage buttons. Clara, just a child then, had run to greet her with delight, asking if she could wear one as a necklace. "Careful, sweetie," her father had said, lifting his whiskey glass without looking up. "You'll catch something from that junk." The comment had earned chuckles from a few of the cousins. Nate, standing by the window in a crisp collared shirt, added, "What are you doing now again?" "Selling bottle caps on Etsy." She remembered holding her breath, willing herself not to cry. "I'm working on a platform to connect sustainable artists," she had explained. "People who create from discarded materials, turning waste into art." Her father finally turned toward her then. "We didn't send you to college to glue garbage together, Ellen." She had looked toward her mother for help, for some sign of support, but Jean had only smoothed her napkin on her lap and avoided her gaze. That was the moment she'd excused herself. She hadn't finished her plate. She'd taken the tote of ornaments with her, though she left one behind on Clara's chair. A small pinecone painted gold, with a loop of velvet ribbon. Back in the present, Ellen stirred the fire absently with the iron poker. Sparks leapt and faded. The weight of those old words still pressed somewhere beneath her collarbone. She stood and walked to the window, pressing her forehead against the cool glass. Her breath fogged a small circle, and she watched as the rain softened the shape of the dogwood tree out front. Her laptop pinged on the desk behind her. She turned slowly and opened the lid. The screen blinked to life. An alert: "Forbes, your profile feature is scheduled to go live in 48 hours. She stared at it for a long time. No smile, no exhale. Just the quiet knowing that everything she had kept private would now be very public. Beneath the alert was an unread email from Lydia: "Hope you got the invite. We'd love to catch up before Thursday. Let me know if you're free to talk." Ellen moved the cursor over the reply box. Then clicked "Mark as unread." She took the pinecone ornament from a drawer near the fireplace. Its paint had faded, and the ribbon was frayed, but it was still intact. She slipped it into her coat pocket, grabbed an umbrella, and headed out the door. The churchyard was only a few blocks away. The path curved beneath arching sycamores that rattled dry branches above. She walked slowly, the air sharp with moisture and memory. Leaves stuck to her boots. At the edge of the yard, under a granite stone that bore his name and dates, her father lay beneath the ground that never froze quite as hard as he had in life. Ellen crouched beside the marker. She didn't bring flowers. She brought truth. She reached into her pocket and placed the pinecone carefully at the base of the headstone, nestling it among damp brown leaves. The rain ticked softly against her umbrella. "Still think it's trash?" she asked, her voice barely more than breath. As she steps onto her porch, headlights shine. Lydia's SUV pulls into the drive. Lydia held a casserole dish like it was a peace offering, and Ellen had no appetite for peace. The porch boards gave a familiar groan under Ellen's slippers as she opened the door. The afternoon light had softened to amber, casting long shadows from the wind chimes near the eaves. Ellen didn't say anything at first. She just stared at the dish, a sweet potato casserole, topped with toasted marshmallows that had begun to sink slightly into the warmth. Hi, Lydia said, voice small, almost breathy. I thought I'd drop this off. Nate made extra. She shifted the glass dish between her hands, the oven mitts clumsy and oversized. Ellen stepped aside without speaking, gesturing toward the kitchen with a subtle tilt of her chin. Lydia walked in slowly, her eyes taking in the space like someone who'd seen it once long ago but wasn't sure it was safe to remember. The radio on the counter hummed quietly, Nat King Cole crooning about chestnuts and open fires. Ellen adjusted the kettle just as it began to sing. She poured water into a teapot without asking what Lydia preferred. They sat opposite each other at the old kitchen table. The same one from her childhood, now with fresh varnish and a crack near one leg that groaned when someone leaned too far. Lydia ran her fingers along the rim of her mug, tracing a small chip Ellen never bothered to replace. It smells like cinnamon in here, Lydia said softly, almost like a compliment that got lost halfway out. Oil diffuser, Ellen replied. Another pause. Ellen stirred her tea. Lydia watched the steam. I didn't expect you to open the door, Lydia admitted. Ellen shrugged. You brought food. Lydia's mouth quirked up for half a second. I brought this same thing years ago, she said. Thanksgiving. You didn't even look at it. I remember. Ellen didn't smile. Lydia cleared her throat. They've been hard. After 2020, the farm nearly folded. We lost a distributor, had a small fire in the greenhouse. Nate tried everything. Loans, side jobs. I was teaching again. Ellen said nothing. Her spoon clinked softly against ceramic. We got a letter one day, Lydia continued. From a bank. There was a wire transfer. No sender listed, just enough to keep us going. I always thought, she paused. Well. I always hoped it was someone who believed in us. Ellen leaned back slightly in her chair. The floor creaked. That's good, she said. That it helped. Lydia didn't push. She didn't even nod. She just let the quiet settle. Outside, Martha from across the street stood on her porch watering her last remaining flower pots. She glanced over once, met Ellen's gaze, and raised her hand. Ellen raised hers back. The thing is, Lydia said after a while, pulling a folder from her tote, Nate's working on something. Something bigger. He's not sure how to pitch it. I said maybe, she placed the folder on the table, but not in Ellen's space. Just near enough. Maybe you'd take a look. You don't have to decide now. Ellen looked at the folder. Plain. No labels. No frills. Just manila paper and 2 corner creases. He's trying to build something that lasts, Lydia added. It's not about proving anything. Not anymore. Ellen didn't respond. The kettle hissed faintly on the stovetop, though it had already boiled. I'll get out of your hair, Lydia said, standing slowly. Thank you for opening the door. Ellen nodded. Lydia reached for her coat, hesitated, then walked toward the screen door. Before stepping out, she glanced back. Martha's right, she said. This porch could use some holiday lights. The door clicked softly shut behind her. Ellen sat for a long while. The folder stayed on the table, untouched. She listened to the hum of the refrigerator, the fading track on the radio, the sound of wind pushing against the siding. Eventually, she opened it. Inside, graphs, notes, a printed outline. Costs, suppliers, pilot markets. And on the last page, in Nate's careful, all-cap handwriting, we believe in the land. We're just bad at asking for help. Ellen reaches into a drawer and pulls out a printed wire transfer receipt from 2020, unsigned. She holds it, then slides it back in. Maple Hall awoke slowly that morning, but Ellen's name was already awake in 100 inboxes and headlines. She hadn't planned to leave the house. But when the sunlight streamed through the lace curtains and caught the dust in golden beams, when the kettle began to boil too loudly and her fingers twitched above the laptop's lid, she reached for her coat. She didn't check the article. She didn't need to. The night before, it had been cued, proofed, scheduled. The moment had already slipped from her hands. Outside, the fog hung low over Main Street like a memory that refused to burn off. Leaves stuck wet against sidewalks. Shopkeepers opened slowly, flicking on neon signs, setting out chalkboards with half-hearted, pumpkin pie latte doodles. The Bean and Hollow's windows glowed warm against the gray. The bell over the door gave its usual weary jingle when she stepped inside. She paused, just half a beat too long. The diner didn't freeze. Not exactly. But forks stopped halfway to mouths. Conversations clipped mid-sentence. Even the radio paused between songs, the silence landing like soft dust on a table no one wanted to wipe. The television above the pie case was tuned to the local station. The cheer-in beneath a smiling anchorwoman read, "How One Woman Turned Trash into Treasure, Ellen Rowe's $97 million startup." Ellen kept her eyes down as she slid into her usual booth, the red vinyl cool against her palms. She folded her scarf into her lap, smoothing it with deliberate fingers. The murmur returned to the room in cautious ripples. Loretta approached like she always did, slow, deliberate, 2 mugs of coffee in hand. She placed one in front of Ellen, then the other across from her, though no one sat there. "Guess we should have named a booth after you," she said with a wink. Ellen offered the faintest twitch of a smile, then reached for the coffee. The mug was warm, the rim slightly chipped. The heat settled in her palms like something she hadn't known she needed. Loretta didn't linger. She walked away, humming to herself, same as always. Across the diner, Clara sat near the window, earbuds dangling from one side of her hoodie. She waved, not big, not theatrical. Just a quiet motion, like someone tipping her hat. Ellen returned it with a subtle nod. There was something in the girl's eyes, a quiet knowing, a flicker of something like pride. Ellen looked away before it grew into expectation. A newspaper rustled 2 booths over. A man cleared his throat but didn't speak. Someone turned the page with exaggerated gentleness. Ellen could feel them all watching without looking. The town she'd grown up in, lived in, walked through unnoticed for over a decade, now couldn't stop glancing her way. The door opened again. This time, it was Nate. He looked like he hadn't slept. Hair slightly out of place, jacket unzipped, folder clutched too tightly in his left hand. He scanned the diner like someone preparing to walk into a courtroom. When he spotted Ellen, he hesitated. Then walked over. He didn't sit. He placed the folder gently on the table across from her, next to the untouched second mug. "If you're still in the business of building things from nothing," he said quietly, "maybe give it a look." No eye contact. No dramatic pauses. Just that. Then he turned and left, hands buried in his coat pockets. Ellen stared at the folder for a while. She didn't touch it right away. The hum of the refrigerator behind the counter kicked in. Clara returned to her sketchpad. Loretta poured coffee for a couple by the window like it was any other morning. Eventually, Ellen flipped the folder open. Inside, spreadsheets, projections, handwritten notes, soil reports, even a sketched blueprint for an eco-co-op model. Neat. Thorough. Not desperate, just unpolished. At the bottom, one line in Nate's writing, "We know the land. We're just bad at asking for help." She closed the folder, placed both hands flat on the table for a moment, as if grounding herself. She folds the proposal, then calls over Loretta, "Mind if I get that to go?" It's unclear if she's leaving, or preparing to move. Ellen hadn't set the table for guests in years, yet here she was, dusting off old dishes and memories. The light in the kitchen had turned golden, the kind that made Warren would glow like honey. A faint scent of cloves lingered in the air, coming from a pot on the back burner where she'd steeped orange peels earlier, more out of habit than intention. The jazz station on the radio played soft and scratchy, a saxophone melting into low piano chords. She moved slowly, arranging mismatched plates along the edge of the table, stopping once to wipe dust from the ridge of an old butter dish. The knock on the door was gentle, almost hesitant. When she opened it, Jean stood there in a navy cardigan, clutching a paper bag like it might blow away if she loosened her grip. Her coat was still buttoned despite the warmth inside. I didn't know if I should knock or call, she said. I brought some things. From the attic. Ellen nodded, stepped aside. She didn't reach for the bag, but she didn't walk away either. The door clicked shut behind them as Jean looked around the kitchen with eyes that held both caution and wonder, like someone re-entering a house they thought they'd only dreamed about. Jean placed the bag on the counter and opened it. A few curled photos slipped out, Ellen at 10 in overalls, painting pine cones on the back steps. A smaller photo of her father holding a pie aloft, laughing. And beneath them all, a folded paper, yellowing at the creases. Your grandfather wrote this, Jean said. I found it in his Bible, tucked under a bookmark. Ellen didn't unfold it. She simply nodded and placed it on top of the fridge, near the jar of cinnamon sticks. They sat at the table. For a while, they talked about the weather. About how early the frost had come. About the grocery store switching their bakery section around. About how someone named Linda was getting married again, third time, and whether she'd keep her maiden name this time. The conversation wasn't smooth, but it was steady. Like old chairs creaking back into place. After a while, Jean exhaled deeply. We didn't know how to support you without understanding you. Ellen looked at her mother's hands. Still wearing the same ring. Still twisting it the way she always did when nervous. She thought about replying. About unpacking all the years that phrase carried. But instead, she reached for the cookbook on the counter, flipped it open with practiced ease, and pulled down the jar of molasses. Do you remember the gingerbread recipe? She asked. Jean blinked. Then nodded. They worked side by side, measuring flour, scooping brown sugar, humming along when a familiar tune played on the radio. The quiet between them changed. It became less brittle. Clara appeared at the screen door like a cat unsure of its welcome. Ellen nodded once, and the girl came in, shaking leaves from her coat sleeve. I brought nutmeg, she said, producing the small jar like it was treasure. Jean moved aside to give her room, and the three of them, awkwardly at first, shared the counter. Clara sifted, Ellen stirred, and Jean rolled dough that cracked slightly at the edges but smelled like every December Ellen remembered. At one point, Clara leaned in and whispered, I think I want to study environmental design. Like sustainable stuff. Probably your fault. Ellen smiled with her eyes. That sounds like trouble. Most good things are, Clara replied, dusting her hands with flour. Later, as the cookies baked and the warm spice filled every corner of the room, Jean sat again and reached for her tea. Her fingers trembled just slightly. Would you come to dinner tomorrow? She asked. No talk of money. Just, bring your rolls, like you used to. Ellen nods softly, then checks the oven. They'll be ready in 20. And maybe, so will she. The house smelled like sage and roast turkey, but Ellen's presence added a new scent entirely, possibility. She stepped inside slowly, taking in the changed but familiar layout. The floors had been refinished, and a fresh coat of paint warmed the walls, but the bones of the place remained, low archways, wobbly coat hooks, the way the late afternoon sun pooled unevenly across the entry rug. In the hallway, family photos lined the walls, some crooked, some clearly dusted for the occasion. Ellen paused at one, her fifth-grade school picture, gap-toothed and beaming, standing beside a pine tree she'd planted. In the dining room, the long table stretched wider than she remembered. Mismatched chairs circled it, some borrowed from the church, others brought from the garage. A plaid table runner ran down the center, lined with candles in mason jars and scattered oak leaves. The aroma of roasted vegetables and baked apples hung heavy in the air. Laughter drifted in waves from the kitchen. She placed the basket of rolls on the buffet and nodded to Lydia, who offered a quick, grateful smile before returning to the stove. Clara darted past, cheeks flushed, holding a stack of plates. When she noticed Ellen, she stopped and grinned. You came, she said, voice bright. Smelled too good to pass up, Ellen replied. As everyone took their seats, there was a moment, just before the clatter of utensils, before the first bite, when things hushed. Clara stood, a glass of sparkling cider in her hand. I just wanted to say something, she began, voice steady. Aunt Ellen, thank you. For showing me that quiet work can still shake the world. Heads turned. Some blinked. A few smiled. Ellen didn't speak, just dipped her chin slightly in acknowledgement. Dinner began. Conversation slowly returned, tentative, polite. Spoons scraped bowls, glasses clinked gently. Someone complimented the cranberry relish. Someone else asked about the weather back in Pittsburgh, forgetting Ellen hadn't lived there in over a decade. She answered kindly anyway. Halfway through the meal, Nate stood. He cleared his throat, fingers fidgeting near his glass. I should have said this a long time ago, he began, eyes scanning the table. But back in 2020, when the farm nearly went under, someone helped us. We didn't know who. We just knew we could breathe again. His eyes found Ellen's. I know now. And I just want to say, thank you. The room fell quiet. Not awkward, not expectant, just quiet. Ellen set her napkin beside her plate and stood slowly. I didn't do it for recognition, she said. And I'm not here to invest in your farm. Murmurs stirred around the table. I want to include it in something bigger, she continued. I've been working on a regenerative farming platform, real partnerships, real impact. And I want to start here, in Maple Hollow. There was a beat of stunned silence. Then a smattering of claps. Then more. But the real acknowledgement wasn't in the applause. It was in the way people leaned forward, really looking at her. The way Nate blinked like he was seeing something he couldn't quite name. The way Lydia touched her heart. And the way Clara beamed, eyes shining. Jean rose from her seat, walked around the table, and wrapped her arms around Ellen. Not stiff, not formal, just a mother's arms, finally catching up to the weight they'd missed. Your father, she said, voice trembling. He wouldn't have understood it, but I think he would have seen your light. Dinner carried on. Candles burned lower. Laughter got louder. People loosened their belts, reached for second helpings, leaned against one another in that half-sleepy, holiday way. Later, after the last slice of pie had been divided and the dishes stacked high, Ellen stepped outside with 2 mugs of cider. Martha stood already on the porch, bundled in a knitted shawl, looking up at the sky. Snow had begun to fall. Not much, just a quiet flurry, soft as powdered sugar on the railing. Ellen handed Martha a mug. They stood together without speaking, the porch light casting halos in the snow. Martha smiled, you turned the whole darn table, didn't you? The clinking of silverware may have faded, but the quiet warmth of that table remained, a place once filled with judgment, now softened by understanding. Ellen never raised her voice, never sought revenge, and yet her kindness echoed louder than any accusation ever could. Sometimes, it's not about proving anyone wrong, but about standing gently in your truth until others choose to see it. Kindness, offered freely, has a way of circling back, quietly, surely, like snow falling on familiar ground. If this story stirred something in you, maybe it's worth looking around your own table and asking whose story deserves to be heard next.